Okay.
Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with David Dietrich and Dr. Mark Andrew Holochak. I'm David Dietrich. I'm filling in for Donna Vitek, who is on scholarly hiatus. I'm a docent at a Thomas Jefferson historical site, as well as an amateur published historian. Mark Holochak holds a PhD in history and philosophy. He taught at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University at Camden, and Ohio University. He has written over 26 books on Thomas Jefferson and his life and times. And he also has had many articles published beyond that.
Whole bunch plenty.
I'm sorry?
Whole bunch plenty.
Today's topic addresses Thomas Jefferson's rather long article to John Taylor. I almost said Tyler. John Taylor, dated 29 December 1794. And without further ado, I'm going to start with the first question, Dr. Holochak, and that is, who exactly was John Taylor, and what was his association with Jefferson, and what was the letter all about?
Well, as you said, it's a very long letter, and it's a very serious letter. Letter concerning, agriculture and agriculture only, mostly practical issues. I guess you could say some theoretical issues because they're going to talk about crop rotation. But Taylor was a younger contemporary of Jefferson. Obviously, they carried on a rather robust correspondence. He was a political theorist, a lawyer, a planter like Jefferson, a legislator, and he was in the Revolutionary War. He was a major in the Continental Army and a member of the Virginian militia. Now, he was a member of the Virginian House of Delegates on 3 different occasions, as well as a member on 3 different occasions of the U.S. Senate. But I say he was a prominent agriculturalist, a theoretician when it came to agricultural matters. He's also a prominent political theorist. So he's someone with whom Jefferson would have had a lot in common. He was an intellectual, politician, farmer, and maybe a bit of a polymath, if you want to say that as well, omnimath, if so that was who Taylor was.
This might be a little of a hot button topic, but was Thomas Jefferson a good farmer, or how was he relative to other folks at the time?
No, he was not a good farmer. How's that for an answer?
Well, that's a short answer.
That's a good answer.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
We talked about this on a different episode. I'll give you a couple different answers. He wasn't a good farmer. He didn't have the time to be a good farmer. He was ambitious, as this letter shows. It's an exceedingly long letter, and he's talking about many different agricultural issues, all these issues of interest to the husbandman. And it would be, to someone who's not familiar with growing, an extraordinarily dry letter when you try to read it. What was your impression when you read it?
Well,
you didn't get goosebumps, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, my extent of my knowledge of farming goes to being able to plant tomatoes. So I'm not a big expert on that at all.
Well, are the deer getting your tomatoes like they're getting mine?
Yeah, of course, they get everything. But
yeah,
anyway, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I'll get an answer your question. I mean, he was ambitious, and at this time, recall what's the date of the letter? 1794.
1794. Yeah, exactly.
But he retires as Secretary of State in December 31, 1793, the last day of the year. So he's excited about going home. He writes all these in his letters. If you look at his correspondence upon returning home, he takes himself to be retired, seriously retired. No more adventure in politics for Thomas Jefferson. He's had enough. And, I have a couple. He writes to George Washington on April 25, 1794. I returned to farming with an ardor which I scarcely knew in my youth, and which has got the better entirely of my love of study. I don't buy that, at least, by the way. Instead of writing 10 or 12 letters a day, which I have been in the habit of doing as a thing of course, I put off answering my letters now farmer-like till a rainy day, and then find them sometimes postponed by other necessary obligation. So he's making a plea for being a very, very serious farmer at this point in his life. What I think is, I'll read a couple other quotes here. To General Henry Knox, 1795, I am become the most ardent farmer in these states, right? His letters, and I've written so many different essays, formal and informal, and chapters and books on Jefferson as a farmer in my book on the Jefferson, the many personae of Thomas Jefferson. I have a whole chapter on Jefferson and farming. I don't know if I shared that with you or not. I think I did. But anyway, he wasn't a very good farmer. When Le Duc de la Rochefoucauld Liancourt visits him upon retirement, the Duke says, little accustomed to agricultural pursuits, he has drawn the principles of culture from works which treat on the subject or from conversation. Thus, knowledge thus acquired often misleads and is at all times insufficient in a country where agriculture is well understood. Jefferson got his knowledge from books like this, Lord Kames' The Gentleman Farmer, which was a very, very largely well read book at his time. And here's another one he took with him when he went to England called Observations on Modern Gardening by Thomas Whately. When he went to see the pleasure gardens with John Adams in England, he takes the book with him. And he's actually looking at the descriptions of Whately and seeing if the descriptions match the gardens. I mean, talk about neurotic. How many people would do that? And he walks away thinking, well, Whately really gave a really very vivid and good description, accurate description, but he's sort of like double checking the guy. And you can't just go out and enjoy it. He's got to make it a scientific experiment of sorts. That's why he wasn't so much of a good gardener. He's a theoretical, not just gardener, farmer. He was a theoretical farmer because his political pursuits did not allow him to time, right? He mentioned in that one letter that I read that, it's difficult for him to find time because of all his political pursuits. And, managing a plantation is a full-time pursuit. And as I said before, we talked about this before, I don't think Jefferson ever was cut out to manage a plantation. I think he found it too boring. It's something that so many other people could do with, modicum of intelligence and so forth. But I think Jefferson, as I said before, was cut out for large things. Running a plantation was not large enough for his talents, and he knew that. So even when he retired, he starts what? He's after his presidency in 1809, he immediately turns to another project. Of course, we talked about the building of Poplar Forest, which he had begun after Monticello in 1806. And after that is completed, he starts the University of Virginia. It's an enormous project. So to Thomas Leeper, he even admits, he says in 1823, says, I have committed the management of the whole of my agricultural concerns, in which I was never skillful and now entirely unequal from age and debility. As the Duke mentions, Le Duc, Jefferson was a theoretical farmer. He didn't have time and the patience to sit down over the course of years of working with his particular soil. You can't manage a plantation or a farm from the presidency, from Washington, D.C., or wherever you happen to be. People are firing guns off here in my neighborhood, as you can see, wonderfully safe. Anyways, so the answer to the question was no, he was a pretty bad farmer, and he admitted that. Not that he didn't have the skills necessary to be an excellent farmer, he did. He didn't have the appetence, he didn't have the, he was cut out for larger concerns, let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's the impression I got also from reading the letter, that he was more into the theoretical and even the mathematics.
Yeah.
That would be part of theoretical, of course, but more, I was just thinking of that specifically. I was really enlightened by seeing the fact that he did really seem to zero in on mathematics, among other things. Not just that, of course, but
he couldn't get through any day without resorting to mathematics 1,000 different times. Just that's how he was. He always says that the theoretical has to take a backseat to the practical, yet he didn't behave that way. I said in a number of publications, oftentimes when he worked something out on paper, he presumed it just had to work out in reality, because just like mathematicians are, you work out something and you say, well, the proof that I've disclosed, it's so elegant and so beautiful, it has to be right. It has to pertain to reality in some measure. And Jefferson was fond of working things out on paper. I talked when Donna was here, we talked about urban planting. He planned out cityscape, a checkerboard pad where you had square, where you'd have buildings on four sides of the square, then the next square would be entirely empty. Then another square with buildings on four sides, empty. Then you'd have roads going through. So you'd effectively be wasting, right, 50% of the space. What you get in return is you get airflow, lesser capacity for epidemics and diseases and things like that to pass through, healthier things, and you actually prevent the growth of cities, because cities have to have space into which they can grow. And if you're not utilizing everything perfectly efficiency, with a perfect efficiency, in some sense, you're forced to spread out over a wider terrain, but then there are natural obstacles that keep the spread down. So his pattern, in some sense, was beautifully done on paper, and it may have worked in practice, but it's just one of those things. He worked things out theoretically, and I think he expected them to work practically.
Okay, I guess that maybe we can come back to that if we have anything more to add. But wow, that's pretty thorough, I would argue. Now, what does the letter tell us about the state of agriculture in late 18th century Virginia?
Well, that's a tough question, because I'm not a husbandman, and I do grow a lot of stuff, and I'm out in my gardens all day long, but it doesn't make me a farmer. I could appeal to the two books, is that the farmers in Virginia, at least, were interested in getting their hands on any kind of books talking about innovations. And I think it was his son-in-law, Randolph, that came up with a matter of growing crops on hillsides, where instead of growing them on the slope, where there would be erosion with rain and wind, he wound up saying is that you cut into the slope like this, so you have little plateaus, and then you can farm on those plateaus. And contour plowing, it's called. And it was an invention, I guess, of his son-in-law. So, I mean, people are always looking for innovations and ways to, the land at Monticello wasn't the best land for growing. As well as the land at Poplar Forest was very rich, and he had he grew tobacco, and what other crops did he grow? I'm sure he grew wheat.
Well, the two major cash crops, of course, were tobacco and wheat. But as we know, the problem with tobacco is that it denudes the soil of nutrients very quickly. We're talking about a couple of years.
Tobacco and corn's not so good.
Now, corn, I think he used mainly, it wasn't a cash crop, at least the poplar forest. It was used to, for feed, basically.
Yeah. If you go back to the letter, I tried to break the letter up, and if I went through all the particulars, I would probably put the listeners and viewers to sleep. He starts off by talking about lack of access to manure, manure for fields. He talks about how people would use manure when he was in France, when he's traveling. There's not enough manure, but the advantage you have, and of course, people in Virginia use this, especially tobacco growers, we had a lot of land.
Yeah.
So you can just, let some fields, leave them in fallow, and then, farm some other fields where these other fields are not doing anything. So if you have a lot of land, it in some measure compensates for manure. So you're not overly stripping the soil of its nutrients.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
No, I just think, that has a lot of merit. I think even when we might apply that to Virginia agriculture. I read a book not too long ago that described the history of that, and the short of it, in terms of the migration pattern, for lack of a better term, of tobacco. The tobacco agriculture in Virginia starts out in Tidewater, of course, and it moves out basically out into this area being south central Virginia. Mm-hmm. And then it turns toward Danville. So by the time of the Civil War, the epicenter of tobacco agriculture in Virginia was the Danville area, almost into North Carolina.
Yeah,
and I guess it's a product of destruction of the soil nutrients, among other things.
You had to. I mean, Lynchburg was, at the time of the Civil War, was growing the best tobacco in the world. Not necessarily producing the most, but they had something like 40 tobacco factories and stuff. I had written on this in my book on Lynchburg.
Yep.
And they did a lot of innovative things with flavoring the tobacco and putting it into squares and doing things with it that no one in the world was doing. And they won a lot of awards for their flavored tobaccos and so forth. One of the innovations that Jefferson is introduced is clover. So he talks about rotation of crops. He's got 7 fields. He breaks up all his farms into 7 fields. Then he's got a 7-field scheme. And of course, he's interfacing through letters with George Washington as well, who was a very serious farmer, politician, statesman, and soldier, and very serious farmer. And these are people who are, trying to make their plantations as successful as possible. Jefferson trying to do it mostly from afar. Clover was a strange crop because if you research it today, it brings nitrogen into the atmosphere. A lot of people, I think the studies are not done complete on this, but a lot of people think, and they did at the time, that it was better than letting your fields go fallow because the animals could eat the clover as well. But the clover prevented erosion of the soil in the event of rain, and it actually introduced some nutrients into the soil. So Jefferson was very, from this, you hear clover, clover, clover. He's talking about, instead of letting a field go fallow, plant clover. In one of his letters to his brother, in the book I'm writing on the critical commentary on the letters exchanged between the two, Thomas introduces his system to his brother. He's talking about the 7 fields, and he says, on the 1 year you do this, and then on the second year, where you're growing wheat, you grow something else. Where you're growing clover, they introduce clover to 2 of the fields instead of what wheat or something. And it's easy enough to understand, but it's also slightly complex when you're talking to someone like Randolph. And Randolph goes, I really love your system, but I just won't be able to implement it. I can't do it right now.
Yeah.
The idea is he just got confused. So it's easy enough to do. You have to, a little bit of mathematics comes into play. I'm talking about a small amount of mathematics comes into play. And obviously, you need to do some experimenting to see how things really work out. In terms of soil, like you mentioned, tobacco is noted for stripping soil of its nutrients.
Big
It's
time.
terrible. But it was a crop that, the right sort of tobacco that John Rolfe grew was very, very popular in England. And of course, tobacco is what made, the Virginia a viable colony. If Rolfe didn't discover that sweet tobacco, who knows what would have happened to colonizing America. So clover is, he's talking about crop rotation and turnips, and talks about ameliorators. He uses the words things that enrich the soil, right? Clover perhaps being one. He talks about vetch, his rotational scheme. Okay, number one, wheat followed the same year by turnips to be fed on by the sheep. Two, corn and potatoes mixed, right? Three, peas or potatoes, and talking about field three, peas or potatoes or both, according to the quality of the field. Doesn't specify what he means by quality, but of course, Taylor's going to understand what he's talking about because he's a farmer. Four, rye and clover sown on it in the spring. Wheat may be substituted here for rye when it shall be found that the second, third, fifth, and sixth fields will subsist the farm. So he's got all these qualifications. Wheat may be substituted when the second, third, fifth, and sixth fields will subsist the farm, but be enough to sustain the farm. 5 clover, 6 clover. In the autumn, turn it in and sow the vetch. So on the 6th field, clover, and then vetch in the autumn. 7, turn in the vetch in the spring, then sow buckwheat, and so forth. So it goes on and on, right? And if you're a farmer, I guess, and you are familiar with rotating crops, this will all be somewhat familiar. If you know the crops that about which he's talking, this will be familiar. But if you're not a farmer, this can seem rather confusing. And even though his brother was a farmer, his brother, when Thomas talked about that, got completely confused. And so we've got experimenting with crops. We've got the problem of depletion of soil, lack of manure, lack of fences, problems with not getting a viable amount of wood to build fences. So Jefferson, I think, talks about having peach trees, used as borders and so forth, doing whatever he can. He's very, very innovative. So I mean, those are the sorts of things he talks about in the letter. And those are the sorts of things that 18th century Virginian planters would talk about, all the sorts of things. And going back to these two books, Whately's book here on observations of modern gardening and the Gentleman Farmer, this is really fascinating. I read through it, and he talks about, here I got the rotation of crops, a whole chapter on rotation of crops, but he's talking about both theory and practice of farming. It's about all planters would have read that book. And Henry Holmes was one of the most important philosophers of his day. He wrote on the moral sense, he wrote on the aesthetic sense, he wrote on just about everything. A very important, one of the most important personages in terms of influencing Thomas Jefferson's thinking philosophically, in terms of husbandry, in terms of what beauty is and things like that. One of the most neglected writers of the time, simply because, neglected today. In his day, he was widely read, highly intelligent man. And I think one of the most important, probably the most important influence on Jefferson's political, philosophical, agricultural thinking, and that even goes for John Locke, right? I come across Keynes all the time when you're reading Jefferson, and Yeah, that's a strong statement, but I think it's true.
Yeah.
That's
And
all I got to say about question 4. So, I mean,
okay.
there's more to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, thinking when you were talking about the amount of land in terms of availability of simply moving crops to other parts of your plantation or whatever, or even the whole agriculture, moving it from one location to another. He had, and I can talk about Poplar Forest. He had originally just under 5,000 acres here. And of course, by the time he handed it off to his grandson, Francis, and it was down to about 1,000 acres, but that's still a lot. And he certainly did not cultivate all that land that he had. But my point is that he had a lot of land available to, expand or move various crops to different fields. And so that seems to be, at least theoretically, an answer to a lot of that, but certainly not a panacea. But
Yeah, but it's a well, we talked about this before. Land was money,
yeah, exactly.
and we don't understand how Jefferson and other people at the time thought about land. It's a person like Jefferson and a person like Taylor could go outside and scoop up the soil and look at it and know what to grow in it, at least Virginian soil. And we take land for granted. When I taught philosophy, I taught philosophy for over 30 years, 33 years. And the young students don't understand what land meant, territories and country. Look at the Ukrainian war and why the Ukrainians are fighting so valiantly. It's their land.
Yeah.
I grow my crops here. Jefferson talks about agriculture in his notes on the state of Virginia. I don't have the book with me, but talks about the farmers are the most, are the chosen people of God. And he says that for a number of reasons. He respects what farmers do. They will defend their land in time of war, whereas someone who's working in a small factory doesn't care. It's not my land. It's my land. I've been growing it. I have so many gardens. I have 3 peach trees, an apple tree, a dead cherry tree. I grow a lot of my own condiments, basil, oregano. I have a large field of oregano and things. And you get an attachment to it. It's just, I've been working that for years. You feel that way. And it's my land. And he writes of it very beautifully at times in his notes on Virginia. And you sort of get the feeling that I agree with just about everything he said, because it is. These are the chosen people of God. And because you're creating something, you're growing something that people need, not gewgaws, right? Things that people don't need, little trinkets and stuff that we have to market to people because they don't need it. But you have to have you just bought a cell phone and a month later you got to buy a new cell phone. Why? Because this one looks better. It does something. It stands up or it sends signals to Mars and back. I don't know what it does, but I'm very, very well versed with cell phones, as you well know. Anyways, I agree with that, but what he doesn't talk about is he doesn't talk about the vagaries of nature, the fickleness of nature, the droughts, the heavy rains that can destroy a crop, and the difficulty. He talks about the fecundity of the land and how nature is abundant, and he's quite right. You open up a marigold, for example, underneath the flower, pull off the flower, you open up underneath it, you find, 200 seeds. Not all of them are going to become marigold, but I mean, nature is profuse, and he has a lot of respect for nature in that way. And he doesn't care for what goes on in the cities and overworking and women and children working in factories. But he doesn't really talk about the difficulties. And there were difficulties, for example, much more at Monticello than at Poplar Forest in sowing and reaping, getting the crop to market, and all sorts of things like that. These were difficulties he doesn't discuss. These were difficulties he experienced all the time, and he never really discusses that.
It was my understanding, like, for example, when they would move Jefferson's tobacco from Poplar Forest and Lynchburg town down to Richmond, of course, they would use bateaus, which are, flat bottom boats, for lack of a better term. And they would put the tobacco on those things. And then it would take them almost a week, sometimes more, to get down there just to transport it from Lynchburg to Richmond. Just to put that in a modern day context, you can make that trip in less than 2 hours today by car. You're not going to buy a car in 1810 or whatever, but wow, that's a long time to get down.
And then you had to have the wheat and all other things. They were rolled up, and so you had to create roads too to get them just to the bateau.
Exactly.
And so forth.
Absolutely.
So it was tremendously difficult getting your crops to the market, assuming you even had a good crop that year. Highly competitive. So he doesn't talk about the difficulties there.
Yeah, that's true. And we have one final question, and I think it's probably one that we could, pull in some of the things that have already been said to answer this. Maybe there's some new information as well. Does the letter offer any clues to unpackaging Thomas Jefferson, the innovative and perhaps even inventive mind? Now, here we're talking, of course, a little bit more specifically about Jefferson's thinking and his productivity in the area of agriculture.
Yeah, he mentions, towards the end of, the drill plow, but he mentions also the mold board. Now Thomas Jefferson, and I'll use my tremendous special effects here, right? The mold board was an improvement to the design of the plow based on the right angle here. And what he thought, he was watching when he was traveling through France, and he was watching a plow go through the soil and struggling. So he came up with a simple mathematical design where you take a right angle and then you use the integral calculus in some sense to go by degrees. You slope so that as the blade goes into the ground, it just digs into the ground just enough to turn up the right amount of soil, offering the least amount of friction. And then the soil will come up, it's not coming up against the wall immediately to stop the plow. It's gradually coming up over there, and it'll be thrown up. So it's a really wonderful design, right? And he won an award for it in France. And of course, Jefferson being Jefferson, he refuses to patent it. He can make money on the design of this wood mold board, and he refuses to because, as I talked of before, Jefferson patents. He beautifully talks of ideas being a thing. An idea in my mind is something I share, and when I share it with you, what I have given is no wise in my mind diminished. I have an idea, I share it with you, I retain the idea 100% in my mind. You get the idea in your head, and it's shared. It's just like sharing a candle that's lit, lighting another candle. Well, you get twice the light, and nothing lost on the first candle. And Jefferson, wrote so beautifully on ideas and patents. He didn't want to patent. He was, in some sense, the director of patents under the George Washington administration, and yet he, in other respects, was against patents. So he refused to patent that design. He wins an award for it. It is beautifully designed in some sense, elegantly, and that gives you an idea too, as I mentioned before, of the 90 degrees of his working something out theoretically on paper. He's using the calculus. Isaac Newton and Leibniz, right, co-discovered, and he's working this out on paper, and it just has to work. And this, in effect, does work. It's an elegant idea, a very simple idea, and one wonders why no one has ever thought of that before. because they never thought of sloping it gradually at increments, precise increments, just like Newton was doing with the calculus, you know.
Yeah.
Newton was talking about what is gravity. It's a force, so that things want to go, you know, in a direction, right? Inertia, things go in the direction, but gravity is a force. If something is moving in a particular direction, gravity is a force that pounds it, that changes its direction, pounds it again. How many pounds does it get? Well, between any two lines, an infinite number of pounds that makes, for example, the moon go in a circle. It's that sort of a force. It's a weird thing, but that's how you get the calculus, and he uses that in there. Pretty cool stuff, I think, Thomas. I'm always, again, you know, that gives you an example of how he's always thinking mathematically. There is a time where Henry Winsett, in his Master of the Mountain, talks about Jefferson, comes up with this great thesis where Jefferson has this idea at some point. He says slavery can be profitable. Well, because he works it out mathematically. And he, you know, gets his cover on the Smithsonian for that. Did Jefferson say that? Yeah. Jefferson thought like that about everything. He's trying to think about how to make everything most efficient, not just slavery, everything.
Which didn't mean he advocated that. It just meant he thought about the analytics.
Yeah, he just always did. I mean, when he traveled, he had a way of measuring mileage, right? Mm-hmm. So he had odometers, what we call them today. He had ways of measuring mileage. He was always thinking, he just could not help but think mathematically. In some regards, I've argued he's sort of a sick person. Really, I mean, neurotic, not psychotic. There's a wonderful distinction. Someone in psychology, you know, the neurotic person builds castles in the sky. The psychotic lives in them. Jefferson was not psychotic. He didn't live in the sky. He built castles in the sky, but all brilliant geniuses do that, right? That's why I always said, I think I said, you got to cut smart people some slack. They're just different. And if you give, John Stuart Mill says that book 3 on liberty, give them their proper slack, the rewards will be super abundant. Not in every case, obviously, but for the most part, yeah, I think so. And Jefferson was like that. He needs his space. Brilliant guy. So that he was always innovating, and you know as well as anybody from working at Poplar Forest, the designs, the inventions, the efficiency things, his polygraph for writing. Mm-hmm. We have polygraph as a lie detector for us. I don't know how they get that. Graphe is writing, and poly means many writing. So a polygraph is something like replicating writing. It's not a lie detector test.
No.
Anyways, I mean, that's about all I got to say on this really chewy. You picked this out, didn't you? This really chewy, difficult to understand letter. I mean, I think I picked this out. Well, what was I thinking? No, it's an interesting letter because it's a very serious letter. Very interesting. I enjoyed reading it. I can't say I followed everything in it because I'm not a professional farmer.
You know, it's one of those kinds of letters that almost compels you to go back and look at it again and maybe closer, because you get this feeling that you might be missing some points there. I don't know if that's true, maybe not, but it just compels you to do that sort of thing, even though, as you mentioned, the topic itself on the surface seems fairly mundane.
Yeah, but you know, I teach a course online on short stories, creative writing, and I always tell people, like, following Jefferson, I don't used to, but Jefferson saw a lot of depth in what is mundane. Always did. Yeah. Where other people would bypass the mundane. He says there's not a sprig of grass to one of his daughters that runs uninterested. I think it's his daughter or granddaughter. Everything, he was fascinated by everything, and he tried to apply mathematics to everything. You can, in any letter Jefferson writes, you can read it again and profit by it. I certainly agree with you. All right, David. I mean, that's all we got to say. We're under a minute, and I think we covered everything efficiently. And we'll do this again. Well, I don't have a topic picked out, nor do you. I think it's your choice. And Donna's coming back soon, and we'll discuss what we're going to do. And,
okay.
You take
Sounds
care, and
good.
we'll